So yeah, so this is for Professor Gajendran Ayyathurai. So you made a very good point. Basically, the generation of social capital and the education as education knowledge acquired by privileged caste, they occupy almost every anthropology and social sciences department here. And you made it a point, very good point, that they have not even taught the Brahmanism to their counterparts so far. It's not only that. If you go in our conferences or in our meeting, when we raise the Brahmanism, there are still students coming from these colleges who counter us. Why are you countering a very small minority group? Why don't you concentrate as a right now they will take immediately the examples of caste atrocities and they will quote that. See, it's all not done by the Brahmins. So it's done by the other castes. So why are you still targeting the Brahmins? So we usually counter that. How we will explain the systematic and how it is basically a system. So maybe you should, to a general public, to larger audience, if you could explain that in your way of putting it across very well, that would be a great help.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Very quickly, yes, going along with the, some of the interlocutors who say, why do you talk about Brahmins and not about the non-Brahmin privileged caste atrocities? It's very true. Some of the worst, bodily violence is happening in India, primarily because of some Yadavas doing it, or 1 year or Tevar fellows doing it in Tamil Nadu. Gruesome death of, you can't even show I can't show the images to my students here in Germany. It's such gruesome, cutting the testes, chopping off the breast and breaking the bones in all possible ways, all because the guy raised an anti-caste question in Tamil Nadu. And then shoving a stick into somebody's bottom. I mean, this just happened recently in Tamil Nadu again. A policeman doing it, forcing a brother and sister to have sex in the police station. A Virginia master did 200 years ago to have, forcing a brother and sister to have a baby so that he could sell. That happened in Virginia 200 years ago. But here in India, in the police station, they do that. So definitely Brahmins don't do that. We need to tackle that. We need to question that. The failure of Dravidian movement, we need to raise that. We should not romanticize it. I agree. But at the same time, if you put, I did field work in Tamil Nadu, if you put a 1 year Tevar and a so-called Dalit, you cannot make any decision between the three fellows. Among the three guys, who would be more articulate or most articulate would be the Dalit guy, clearly, because in terms of, this is a long tradition. How Ayyathurai, who lived between 1845 to 1914, he says his great-grandfather was a great writer and publisher. Now, how do you reduce a pariah as an untouchable? We don't know much about them at all. So that way, the deep anti-caste history, the modulus community's contribution to language like such as Tamil or Bengali, we have not studied yet. It's a Badalog perspective of Bengali, and that's how it's happening. So you have this atrocity, I understand, but definitely the intellectual basis for casteism doesn't come from a 1 year fellow or a Tevar fellow or Yadav. They cannot speak for more than 5 minutes. But a Brahmin would use a text to attack and reduce how somebody is low, the other is, he himself is better than others. That centrality, as Wilkerson calls, the Brahminical male power centrality in any conversation, in any standpoint, that arrogance is built over a period of time. It comes from them. So that kind of wherewithal, 1 year doesn't have, a Yadav doesn't have. So I think we need to find this out, how they mobilize texts, how they interconnect and rely on mythologies, and our inabilities, our fears of death, not knowing about your previous birth and after your birth. So all this a Brahmin male would articulate. So that way, I think we need to really show the intellectual basis of casteism comes from Brahmanism, Brahmin male power in a big way. Whereas the foot soldiers, for example, Babri Majlis was destroyed not by many Brahmins. OBC and the Dalits would have done probably. That's how they did it, right? We have a picture of L.K. Advani and Modi ji addressing the car sevaks. So Modi ji is a chai wala, as he says, right? So they all colluded very nicely, but the OBCs and the Dalits have been the foot soldiers of Brahmin male power, right? So that way we need to accept the middle caste and the lower caste atrocities on communities such as Dalits. At the same time, point out, look, what the Brahmin folks in the intellectual field have done, in the religious field have done. And there are in Chennai companies which recruit only Brahmins. There is a friend of mine who's a big banker in New York. He said he went to a Brahmin's company. First time he couldn't get a job. Next time he put a sacred thread visibly and went, and he was given a job. So these things are going on for a long time. So we need to point that out. That's how I think we should show the young people, look, there is an anti-caste position where people can come together, ex-Brahminize, and come together as anti-caste vernacular community formation. So I stop here.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
I had a question. Can I go ahead? Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, this question is for Mr. Gajendran. So in India, every year during the Rath Yatra, people die because of stampede.
Okay.
And somehow people get together, the huge wheels, which is, I don't remember the size and dimension of the wheels, but there's hundreds of people who go together, they get stampede.
Yeah.
And recently, over the last 10 years, the Indian Army has improved, the Home Ministry has improved, and they're able to save people from floods, which basically are hitting the entire state and so on and so forth, but cannot save people from this group walk and trying to pray God, and then people die. Hundreds of people die every year, and nothing has happened to it. There's nothing you can do. That's one question. The second thing is about the religious killing, like, the Sikhs especially, who basically came out of India during the 1987 Indira Gandhi stuff, and they're all over Canada and US, and when they hunt their own sisters and they kill, this happened 5 years back, 10 years back, in the name of family, in the name of religion. And I think people have changed now, or probably a little bit modernized with the Facebook and all of those things, but still that what do you call the family and religion and so on and so forth. And then coming to America, so I live in Virginia. In my own office, when I used to work, I've spent 13 years in a bank, and there was a guy who started rattling about casteism, and I couldn't say much, and I had to listen in. But in my heart, I couldn't say anything because I'm in America. I'm an outside country, and I'm an Indian, and I cannot go about all these things because it affects our work and our social status and everything. So I had to listen in, and I had to just walk away. But the thing is that the casteism is real. It affects everybody's thought process, and especially like what Mr. Gajendran was talking about, the temple and the people visiting. Last time we had to go for this Ganesh Chaturthi in the temple, there were like 500, 600 people. I'm going because my wife is Maharashtrian and therefore I'm getting along and so on and so forth. But internally, there's a struggle in me that we're following something. Do I believe in it? Do I not believe in it? But for the sake of family, I'm following that. But then everything comes back to the casteism.
Right. Correct. Thank you for the question. A quick reaction is that this is a struggle. I don't know how are we going to do this. Why Ayodhya now? And clearly, like I said in my talk, it is to re-establish what is called Sanatani Dharma. And in the Caribbean, in Suriname, in Guyana, when I was interviewing people, someone said, we don't even want to be called as Hindus. We want to be called as Sanatanis. That means Sanatani Dharma means eternal order. So they want an order, caste structure, very clearly. So Brahmin should be a Brahmin, Shudra should be a Shudra, and untouchable should be an untouchable. So they clearly want that order to be established. So, and clearly the most important thing is the deity. So which deity? Which deity? And so if I ask you to draw a Ram, you will need a muscular, fair-skinned Ram you would draw. This comes from a calendar art in the last 150 or 200 years, right? So the way we imagine gods and goddesses, complete recent fabrication. So the temple culture, the establishment of temple, a Brahmin male as a priest, where his own wife cannot go, his own daughter cannot go, they insult their body, menstruation, but a man can have sex and so on, and then go into, and priest also, probably he also pees in the sanctum sanctorum. It's okay. So all these things happen, right? So the temple, the psychology, I don't know, it's a big struggle, particularly for the social scientists and humanities people. How do we break free our Indian folks from this, paranoia and the hysteria of what you said as death, stampedes? People die, hundreds of them, yet they do. What is it? And inequalities probably, right? So like, the class differences. 75% of Indians are in unorganized sector. That means they don't have a regular wage, they don't have a regular job, they don't have insurance, they are meant to die. And many of them are lower caste and untouchables. It's okay, you can dispense. Today is Ganesh Chaturvedi, right? So my schoolmates, many of them are Brahmins, sent an image where they pour, pots after pots after pots of milk. How many people could have been saved with that milk? And it's all going down the drain. So how do you stop another Ayodhya coming? And that too, after the destruction of a mosque or a church is going to happen. So this cycle is going to go on. This is a challenge for all of us, anti-caste philosophers, anti-caste thinkers, to continuously raise interrogating the architecture of a temple, interrogating the trustees of a temple. In the US, every temple has trustees. Please find out what other caste do they belong to. So we need to engage with this. A long struggle. It may not happen, but we need to stop another temple coming in the US, in Europe, to show very clearly this is a casteist place. It's high time we do it. Probably that would have a global effect. Yeah, I think I'd leave it at that level.
So Dr. Gajendran, this is Kalishwaran. I have one question. So this Ganesh Chaturthi, even I used to be a very big ardent devotee for some time, and over the time I learned and I stopped all this rituals thing. But I have a general question, thinking about the past, how they manipulated. Like if you take 50, 100 years back, not many Ganesh temples around, but every nook and corner they keep, even under the tree, they started putting small idols and make it a temple. And now everywhere they're in last 20 years they made it super popular business, right? The way it put decorated, and then they can put it in the river, put it in the well and all that. They made it like a more commercial right now. So I'm saying when they started 50, 60, 70 years ago, nobody questioned them. Then slowly they started occupying the market, started occupying the people's mind, right? So everything they start, they have an intention of manipulating something in 30, 40 years, right? So we have to doubt everything, ask question everything, and we need to continuously watch right now. They build something in Ayodhya right now. What is their next plan? How they may start in a different name. So we have to continue to ask questions, look around. And my question is, many of I'm from Tamil Nadu, remote village, and maybe many of us in the forum as well, or in the different regions but different villages. So we used to have a village god, right, which Brahmanically would never celebrate, right? We used to even offer the live chickens, live goats, and all that, right? So whenever we talk about it, this kind of take back. Oh no, right? Take back, and then invite us to join them. Not they will not come down. Is it something if we go back, right? Go take your Kula Toril. Why don't we take Kula Sami, right? Why don't we take our own god and then we start celebrating only that and then start worshipping that? Will it break their system in a way so that there is a, because at the end of the day everybody needs some deity to celebrate. So if we go back to their own village type of god, will it anyway help some of the people who cannot come out of the religious thought or anti-caste immediately? They may take few more years or maybe a couple of decades, right? Coming out to anti-religious, anti-caste. So in the meantime, they need something. Maybe it is their own village god which they can stick to right now, right? So can that be an intermittent step to start? Like for example, you have heard about Karpasamy, Ayyanar, Munishwaran, and all that, right? Why don't if we build a temple in US, right? And then there are a lot of people start coming to it. So it is definitely a hit for the the Brahmanical Hindu cultural thing where they're building everywhere the Ganpati or Shiva temples. If you build Ayyanar temple, right, then it is a religious thing, so they cannot escape. At the same time, it's a hit on their head of their plan. Do you see that as a workable response to them, or is it we in the wrong? Is it in the wrong direction?
Okay. Thank you for the question. I'll come from my, and try to answer this from my fieldwork in the Caribbean. So why I started this diaspora studies recently is to understand whether people who left India in 1834 onwards, first time they were sent to Mauritius. So many of them were marginalized community folks who took to this indentured labor. So, and then very consciously, even when they were in this arduous voyage, they were writing poems against casteism, clearly attacking Brahminism. Marina Carter talks about such poems. People were writing against Brahminism. Oh, finally we are escaping from Brahminism and never to come back. Now, could they actually succeed in anti-caste cultural identity outside India? That's my quest. I'm trying to study. Now, very clearly, you'd be surprised to know, Indians after 5th generation, people who were born there, never came back to Tamil Nadu. We have Mariamman temples in Guyana, and we have Madurai Veeran temples in Guyana. So Madurai Veeran is the god that I came to know from my mom. So I'm anti-caste person. Imagine in Guyana, Madurai Veeran, Sangili Murugan god in Guyana. I have pictures, and so I asked why, and clearly this they have retained in a way, and they don't talk about caste, and it's an inclusive. Muslims go, Christians go. They, like you said, they sacrifice a pig, they sacrifice a goat, they sacrifice a chicken, and they drink and smoke. All those things happen. I want to do more fieldwork on this. So clearly, this is an anti-caste culture they want to hold on to. They don't want to give up. And clearly, in contrast, guys who went as caste, if you mention as a Brahmin, you were not taken as an indentured labor because it's for hard labor, right? So, and then guys, after going there, they somehow fabricated and all their identify themselves as Brahmins now. And now they are constructing, there is a clear debate between Brahminical temples and non-Brahmin groups. And so this goes on. But having said that, so I'm not really sure whether, say, Sangili Murugan could create an anti-caste community among the Tamils. I'm fully not sure. So I think we need to, religion as a way of building anti-caste community, I'm fully not sure. I have to think through it. Buddhism, yes, in a way it has helped, and it is a diverse one. That's why in ancient days, anti-caste communities took Buddhism. There is Tamil Buddhism, there is Telugu Buddhism. So they took to it in their own text, in their own vernacular Buddhism. So that way I think we should find, I understand there is a place you want to go relax, you feel, think about calm, and probably an anti-caste Buddhist thinking would be a right place to go. I'm fully not sure. So Madurai Veeran and all these local gods and goddesses who have been anti-caste gods and goddesses could connect a bigger vernacular anti-caste Tamil community. I'm fully not sure. This could be spread across India to understand. So temporarily it might, but instead of this particular god or goddess-based anti-caste community formation, probably we should think about other factors, economic aspects, the way we can come together, new celebrations, new festivities. We come together, cook food, eat meat, fish, whatever, drink or smoke, whatever, come together, do it, and then talk about things like, every damn Tamil Indian movie is about love, but you fall in love, they do what is called caste murder, which is called honor killing. What is this? So probably we need to create alternative festivities, important days where people can, this is an anti-caste get together, a lot more humanistic, inclusive, woman-centered. That is very important. Women should take the lead. And so that way we are gender sensitive. So that kind of new activities, new celebrations, I think we need to probably invent and think about it in history, come together. That's where I'm heading as of now. I'm fully not sure whether Madurai Veeran itself or Mariamman itself can come up with a broader anti-caste community, either in Tamil Nadu or Pochamma in Andhra and elsewhere. So
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gajendran. There are many questions have come up in the chat. I will go. So I see first question by Adriana. Adriana, do you want to go with the question? I couldn't find your question. Oh, okay, I see that. The question for, I will read the question for you, Adriana. This question is for both speakers. With apologies for the US-centric question. Much is being made of Kamala Harris' caste background as Tamil in the US media. What do you make of this media phenomenon addressing, naming, or even acknowledging caste, its interrelation with blackness and Caribbeanness in her public persona as a political candidate? And do you think this will have any effect on normative caste politics in the US?
Anu, please go ahead. I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, we might have the same answer. I don't know. I think this is, it is really a very interesting moment. And I think we should sort of focus on the fact that, there is both an effort to commensurate race and caste, but they're incommensurable also, right? It also goes back, and I see a question that's asked by Meena Danda about I think precisely that kind of incommensurability, right? It's the same kind of caste-coded work, but it happens in different spaces, and surely, the context matters and so on. So, with that said, I'm afraid that in terms of the normative caste politics in the US, I have my grave concerns. I mean, part of the Kamala narrative is certainly about the Iyer background, the Tambram background, partly. But I think there's also this kind of very interesting comparison between her and Barack Obama. Right, that they're both, in a sense, children of the moment of sort of a moment of global decolonization, and then what happens in the U.S. in response to that, in terms of the formation of Black Power and various other forms of anti-racist politics that both of them sort of come into. And so there's an effort to think about a kind of global anti-racist moment, decolonization and so forth on the one hand, and then I think what's happening within the US. And in terms of, I think, Harris's own persona and the ways in which she figures herself, I would be not just concerned about, the consequences for normative caste politics, but I think thinking about the broader politics of the relationship to India and to Hindu nationalism today, what kinds of stances someone like her might take. I mean, this is going to be a huge issue around, let's say, Kashmir. There is a huge issue around, how do we actually think about the forms of authoritarianism that are taking shape in India today, and really the absolute closure on any kind of civic activism and so forth that we're beginning to see. And this is going to pose a very interesting problem, right? So one is the model minority, Indians as a kind of model minority, deeply enabled and empowered, especially financially, the kinds of money that has been flowing to India and so forth. So how in the face of this do you maintain at least a glamorous radical self, right? Which I think is also what Harris is doing. And so in that context, I think one would want to be probably a little bit more thoughtful and resist the sense that this is some kind of an easy set of alliances that we're going to see. That she's going to be able to say, look, I identified more with Black politics. I understand what it means for me to be, Tamil Brahmin. And, my Black politics actually allows me to go back and rethink that self in a slightly different way. And that, I think, is the incommensurability, in a sense, of anti-racist and anti-caste politics on the one hand, and then the narrative of decolonization. So, I mean, I would also, I think there's this broader question, and Gajendran was speaking about Wilkerson, but, this very interesting way in which, if you think about Black radicalism in the United States, the radical Gandhi becomes much more available to them than Ambedkar does, right? Including for somebody like Du Bois, right, who is introduced to Lala Lajpat Rai and so on and so forth. So I think we see this very interesting way in which the question of caste and the question of anti-colonialism are rendered incommensurable, right? They're doing different kinds of work, which is why, again, coming to the question of indenture, which Gajendran was mentioning, the Gandhi of indenture, the South African Gandhi, who's actually, his intellectual formation is in South Africa. that South African Gandhi doesn't become important for the reception of the radical global Gandhi, including amongst Black intellectuals in the United States. King comes from that tradition. Right? So, so I think those incommensurabilities would be something that we wanted to think about. A very long-winded answer, Adriana, to your question, which is, the simple response is no. I don't think that this is going to be a radical moment for caste politics in the US. But I think to ask the question, why is it not that kind of an easy alliance between Black politics and anti-casteism? Is, I think we also have to ask that more complicated question, perhaps.
My quick thing is, I think Anu put it very nicely, and then, and then she was very clear in saying, now this is not a great moment for anti-caste politics in the US. I think Anu is fantastic. But I somehow, and like, Anu, I had some glimmer of hope, So this is, thankfully, this woman had chosen a Black man to get married. And then, and clearly identified her two children as they're going to be Blacks and they should be brought that way, sent her to Harvard and so on. So that is a refreshingly different thing in that sense, I'm hoping. But here in Tamil Nadu, the Brahmins are celebrating, here is our woman and that kind of stuff. And they're not talking about her anti-race position and so on. And then they would have to talk about their own anti-caste position, right? So they are very selectively appropriating, and Anu is absolutely right. And then I think hopefully Kamala Harris understands this and she has to take a standpoint. That her standpoint is, like, look, I'm anti-race as well as anti-caste. If she does that, this is going to be fantastic for African Americans and South Americans and then anti-caste Indians. That will be a clinching thing, unlike anything before. Hopefully she has that vision to do that, but I'm not fully sure either, especially after hearing Anu and your question, Adri. Thank you.
Also because, I think in the US, you've got the complexity of multicultural politics, right? Which is actually about the equal representation of difference. So South Asians in the US, fall into that space. And then you've got the history of, anti-casteism. And so that has to be in some sense either accommodated within a broader, multicultural politics, or it has to be put at orthogonally to it in some sense, right? It's like saying, there's multiculturalism and there's affirmative action. These have very different bases, right? Affirmative action, including in the United States, if you think about the question of racism and so on and so forth, the question here is about historic discrimination, right? The line, it is about, racial capital, it's about slavery, it is about, segregation, and the line in some sense, to my mind, leads towards the question of reparations. Multiculturalism is about the equal recognition of all difference. And that is an accommodation within, you could say, the kind of American public sphere, and including in the legal domain, which is to accommodate the fact that, you've got enslavement and slavery and that narrative sitting alongside other forms of migration, immigration, forced, voluntary, desired, undesired, economically necessary, and so on and so forth. But it's a complicated space for that reason. That is why it is a settler colonial society, right? With a set of implications about how it manages difference. So there is a kind of original relationship, you could say, along the kind of, racial hierarchy. And then there is the question of, migration, immigration, and the management of other kinds of difference. And the counterposition of the one against the other, which produces then the possibility of having Indians in the United States, unlike, for instance, I would imagine, South Africa, Kenya, all of the Caribbean spaces that have seen Indian indenture, Fiji, Trinidad, etc. You're able to actually create and constitute an enabled Indian model minority here. Again, absolutely riding roughshod over the long history, the century-plus long history of radical South Asians, including agricultural labor on the west coast of the United States. So it's an interesting moment. One finds oneself on the one hand, maybe appreciating Kamala's mother a little bit more than Kamala, I have to say. Maybe there's also kind of political nostalgia for that moment, but it's a weird position that one is in.
Thank you, Dr. Anupama and Dr. Gajendran. So we have 4 questions. I hope we have time for you both, right? So the question from Meena Danda, I will read it for you, Meena Danda. The question is for Anupama. In terms of the political economy of caste, what do you think is the implication of the disconnection between traditional occupations and caste that takes place in the diaspora? So-called upper castes undertake degraded labor in their adapted countries that they would not have done in India: cleaners, bus drivers, postmen, etc. How should one theorize this break caused by altered conditions of labor?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. Really a fantastic question. I think it would require a really long kind of a response, but I think the kind of, perhaps, one of the ways that one could think about it, maybe the easier response would be to draw on what I was saying, that, these are partly incommensurable histories, right? So one comes into a certain historical context, and one certainly does come into a historical context here where, let's say the dignity of labor, in some sense, operates quite differently. The simple response then would be to say that, you're within a system where what would be considered degraded labor has been either revalued or redefined, as a kind of dignity of labor. Now, the other questions around, labor and capital, what's happening with unionization, exploitation and so on remains. But I think this question of sort of status, hierarchy, and exploitation, or humiliation and exploitation, that link which you see with degraded labor in India, sanitation labor, leather work, all of the forms of some forms of daily wage labor, agrarian labor, and so on, that relationship between humiliation, a kind of historic humiliation of the labor process and the kind of labor that you're doing, and the modern forms of exploitation and the ways in which they cohere, that link, I think, very simply gets broken. That would be one way of responding to, I think, this question of, the altered conditions. That does not mean that we don't then have to rethink the question of labor as such, right? And if we are to think about labor as such as always already locked in a historic agonistic conflict with capital, then we have to rethink then, the conditions of caste capital as opposed to other formations of capital here, perhaps in the UK or the United States. That's a different kind of work. But I think just provisionally, I would suggest that humiliation and exploitation, that might be the kind of divide in some sense. It's very interesting in this context also to go back and think about Ambedkar and why Ambedkar might be against, why he remains a social democrat. Because one of the big things for Ambedkar, I think, throughout many of his sort of economic programs, projects, and his economic activism, the focus for Ambedkar is actually to move degraded labor into the domain of calculation. That is to render it modern, by which we mean we enter it into capitalist relations. Free wage labor, right? We actually recognize it as wage labor. Now, that comes with other kinds of contradictions. It comes with the requirement of rethinking then the condition of, the freedom of, entering into wage labor and so on. But that's the second moment, right? For Ambedkar, the question is, the Mahar Vatan actually doesn't even count as labor. It counts as custom. So let's change customary labor into labor that can be calculated, enumerated, and can enter the wage labor contract. He kind of stops there. Now, the second step certainly might be to say, well, now what happens? How do we use degraded labor as the conditions for thinking labor as such, rather than the universality of, the labor form in terms of, the working classes in Europe? That's a different kind of work, and I think it's a second order movement or moment that calls for. But I think the radical move is first and foremost to enter the domain of universal equivalence. then we can think the general strike. Then labor can withhold, right, essential services and so on. But, how do you withhold, essential services as sanitation labor? Right? This is deathly labor. You don't do it. You are, you're anyway disposable. You're remaindered. You don't do it. It is a matter of survival. So that situation of precarity, which humiliated labor, degraded labor produces, I think is distinctive from thinking about labor as, I will use the term, merely exploitation.
Thank you, Dr. Anupama. There's another question from one of the friends. The question is, how can Dalits, Muslims, Sikhs, and other victims of Brahmanism unite to expose and defend against these atrocities?
I would like to.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
So maybe a quick answer would be that this is what I'm hitting at. And, let's think about why Mayawati is not successful in other states beyond UP. It's not, very powerful anti-caste Dalit leader and so on. That's how, at least she had that kind of a start from, anti-caste majority concept. Now she's getting into savarnas, all varnas, and all of them should be there, all castes should be there, and all varnas. Very sad turn in a political perspective. Now, so this is what, as I said in one of the slides, vernacularization is important. Now, this comes from my own research of Ayyathurai. So Ayyathurai knew 4 languages. He knew Sanskrit, he knew Pali, he knew English and Tamil. In fact, one of the English articles was titled as "Who are Untouchables?" So Ambedkar has the same. Ambedkar, I don't know, for some reason, I didn't see any reference of, to Tas in Ambedkar's writing. But of course, Lakshmi Narasu, who was a very close compatriot of Ayyathurai, Ambedkar looked up to. In Ambedkar's perspective of Buddhism was deeply influenced by Tamil Buddhism. Now, Ayyathurai talks about 22 linguistic zones of his time, 1914, that's when he dies. So he clearly talks about the anti-caste struggle in terms of vernacular politics. I go along with that. So today, if you want to reconstruct the anti-caste history of a Jharkhandi, you don't have archival materials in English. So all of our writers, historians, anthropologists, we are saying, oh, let's go to London, library and the India Office Library, get some, there are no records. Therefore, there is no positive history of Dalits or what? There is no positive history of Jharkhandis or what? They've been fighting for long. It is in their vernacular. I need to know the, Munda and Ho and other languages to unravel their history. It is in their memory. It's in their folklore. It's in their folk traditions. Okay, it is in their language. So, and how have they been surviving Brahmanism and its atrocity, deprivation, all that for long? It is in the vernacular. So, so Muslims' contribution to Tamil language we have not studied enough. And they've been there. Many Muslims, Tamil Muslims, don't know Urdu or Arabic, right? Likewise, the other day I was invited to speak in the Bengali circle a few weeks ago. I have a lot of, more than 200 Bengalis were there. I asked this question: why should Bengali be seen only through the Bhadraloks, the privileged caste point of view? Let's push aside Tagore and other Mukherjees and Banerjees and Chatterjees, all of them. Let's look at it from the middle caste and lower caste and, low caste or so-called, oppressed women's perspective. Can we do that? How have they written this language? So that way, a vernacular way of mobilizing anti-caste community, a lot of potential, I think, to bring together people. Even as they may have religious differences, they could be atheists, and they could be, a class perspective person. It's all fine. They can come together in a very vernacular way. That is, I think, also a lot of possibility to project an anti-caste perspective. That is in contrast to a subcontinental Sanskritic Brahmin male perspective, right? So the imposition has to be there for them to succeed, right? So, and it has to, I speak Hindi, so, but I know vernacular languages have to be protected. We already know in North India, multiple other non-Hindi languages are dying because of Hindi domination. right? So that way, I'm heading in the direction of vernacular anti-caste identities as a way where we can bring in anti-caste, class perspective, gender perspective into the court and build a movement in every zone. That's my thought. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Gajendran. Great answer. And I really personally wanted to know more about this vernacularization. But anyway, I will keep it for later. There are two more questions. We can end it after the two questions. The next question is from Bhavishya Ravi. There was an atrocious WSJ article that was pushing the Brahmin victimhood narrative. I also read that. Actually, how do we respond to this? That's a question.
Anu, go ahead.
Yes. I mean, this is, I think this is rightfully the place where I think what Gajendran was also suggesting, that, if we're really going to think about questions of anti-caste solidarity, then clearly it's going to be a kind of alliance or an allyship or a solidarity across difference. There's another question about challenging family members and challenging upper caste family members. And so, one does do a different kind of work here, right? I mean, one can be an Ambedkarite, but I can't identify historically as Dalit, because that is not my structural position. That's not my historical position. That's not my context, right? So there's, one comes into a kind of politics, and I think one also takes responsibility, the ethical question of responsibility, complicity, all of the questions that I think Gajendran was beginning with when he talked about Brahmanism and, why don't we have Brahmins writing, Brahmin ethnography, for instance, or accounting for, Brahmin power from within. So I think this is perhaps the kind of place where precisely this kind of a move is called for. Because, the argument certainly that's made, and this comes from certainly the southern country, and I'm not from Tamil Nadu, but I'm from Karnataka, from Bangalore, and there's, across South India, the argument is very much that, the norms of proportional representation of reservations meant that, the smartest of smart Brahmins could not find a place anywhere in civil service, bureaucracy, etc., the limited spaces of, license Raj, if you will, and needed to flee. That's been the overwhelming narrative. I think the WSJ piece is precisely talking to this. And wow, here are people who are constrained by projects, if you will, of historic remediation. Right? Reservations is a project of historic remediation. I was not there. I was not the perpetrator. Why am I having to bear the cost? That's the argument here, right? So we've all been victims of historic remediation. The moment we come to the US, where we are not bound by these kinds of rules, my goodness, look at the way that we excel, right? We create companies. We are, at the top of the pops, etc. And so I think, one has to challenge this narrative from within. And one has to challenge this narrative around the question of redistribution, around making an argument for the worth and value of historic remediation. And I think this actually is the hard work that upper caste communities and minorities in the US have to do. So I think that would be my kind of response in some sense to the call that Gajendran was also making for allyship and solidarity, that, we come into those spaces from very different positions. There's the political sort of conversion, if you will, and I think surely we have to take that very seriously, that there is the possibility of coming into a kind of intellectual, ethical space that can transform one. But one also comes bearing the responsibility for being a carrier, if you will, of a certain kind of history. And I think this is where that hard work has to be done. But Gajendran, I also wanted to ask, and maybe just to open up a kind of space where there may not be complete agreement on this, which is, that I'm completely in favor of the idea of sort of popular archives, language, vernacularization, and so on. But I think one also sees the enormous impact of the claim to the universal. I mean, if you think about somebody like Ambedkar, you think about somebody like Du Bois, you think about Ayyathurai and so on as well, the claim there is not for separatist knowledge, right? It is to say, look, I can do all of this. I've got that space where the vernacular is producing knowledge that is being ignored by others. but I also lay claim to universal knowledge. I know Greek, right? I speak Latin. I can do this as well as you and better. I mean, this is Ambedkar times 10, right? Or he is in that sense, I mean, who could in any ways challenge Ambedkar's kind of academic formation? If you just think about it, in very basic, evidentiary terms, he is the most decorated intellectual of his time amongst all of the Indian nationalists, right? Nobody can challenge that. So I guess I'm wondering, Gajendran, sort of just coming back as well, how do we want to think about sort of, remaking knowledge in some sense? It seems like we also need to work from both of these ends is what I'm suggesting.
I agree. So I completely agree with you. And so there is this imagine, like I said, Ayyathurai has published, he dies in 1914 and he published a journal called Tamilan. I was intrigued by this very title. And so his own relative, Rattamalai Srinivasan, was publishing a journal called Parayan. So who the hell are you to call me a Paraya? Yes, I am a Parayan. And this is what our tradition is. That's how Rattamalai Srinivasan was going. And this led to a court case. Rattamalai Srinivasan, in his journal, which we don't have any full, we published in 1893 and 1900, I guess. So in 1899, I think that was the last issue. So in one of the issues, he referred to Tas as a pariah. And then Tas went to court, filing a case against Rattamalai Srinivasan, and Tas won, saying yes. The judgment was yes. A person who, the way he or she wants to be identified should be accepted, and you should not point out the cost of the person. So Ayyathurai wins, and then anyway, the journal is called Tamilan. Now, I was pondering over, why did he call us Tamilan? He was one of the pioneers of that kind of thinking. I need to shed my bloody caste to identify with you if you speak my language as one. No man-woman difference. And so they were talking about sexuality and so on, very clearly. And so thankfully, an article of mine, which I call Critical Caste Feminism, has been accepted based on this material in a top journal. So that way, these guys were very progressive. They were talking about they were talking about St. Louis women sitting in Chennai, 1907. They were talking about the Japanese women. So there was and they were talking about underground railroads of the US, which helped the African Americans to escape into Canada. So imagine guys sitting in Chennai, 1907, talking about underground railroads of African. So that way, the universal vision has always been the anti-caste folks. They're ready to take. And what I call, they were radical modernists. I use this phrase, radical modernists. They wanted to break free from the damn caste and open up to the world and take in as much as you can. And even as they were holding on to the language, I communicate with you, you communicate with me. You don't try to impose your language on me, I will not on you. So can we build this is our knowledge tradition. This is he was a medicine man too. So that way, I think the vernacular should never be given up. And that's where the repository of positive memory of the oppressed, what I call. I'm also getting into memory studies now to understand the cultural memory and communicative memory of the oppressed. How have they communicated between generations? How have they retained the knowledge from a couple of centuries ago? Do we care about the positive memory of the oppressed? Or we are looking at it from the Brahmin male point of view? So it's very important. So when you do that, and I can't do it with Hindi or Malayalam, I have to do it in Tamil Nadu as a Tamil speaker with my own mother tongue. So in that sense, if you want to rebuild the anti-caste positive history of the oppressed, the vernacular plays a very vital role. And I take with you, and it's not like, ethnocentric, this is my best Tamil, like some of the DMK guys or AIDMK guys do. No, I don't mean that. So the global and the local have to be interconnected. Imagine the indentured labor publishing Tamil magazine in Durban. I'm yet to go there. They were publishing in 1907. So, and they were Buddhists. So that way, this interconnection has to be local, global, universal, local, I think have to be celebrated. Thank you, Anu. So
thank you, Dr. Anupama. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Gajendran. Okay, thank you everyone for participating, and thank you for the whole guest, Dr. Gajendran and Dr. Anu.
Thank you. This was wonderful. This is really wonderful.
We really appreciate it.
Very wonderful, and thank you so much. And it was a lot of details, and we really need to work together for the future. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Beautiful to see you all. Thank you. Continue the good work.
Thank you all.
Right.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Yeah. Have a nice weekend.
You too. Bye. Yeah.
Bye.